Welcome to Our Creatures Podcast. This is Chris, and today I'm really excited to have Ian Recchio, who's the curator of reptiles and amphibians from the LA Zoo. Hey, Ian.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing awesome. And, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. We have some amazing stories to talk about, some of the work that not only you're involved with, but also the Los Angeles Zoo, which is now quickly becoming my new hometown zoo. Love it. Love your facility. Love your, it's an amazing place to go, and you're doing such amazing work. So one of the first things we always like to ask is just, kind of give us a background on you, where you grew up, and obviously you're living in Southern California, right?
Sure. Yeah. I've grew up in Southern California. This is, I popped around the city here and there, but always seem to come back to the Burbank area, LA area. It's been an interesting ride as to, how I got to become a zoo man. Started as a kid going out to the desert, and had two great parents that emphasized wildlife and wild places and art and nature in general, and just really kind of jump-started my interest in this whole thing.
From a fellow Southern Californian, so you said going out to the desert, is that kind of where your interest in conservation began?
Well, Southern California is the desert, essentially. So we live in a desert. We're close to the four main deserts of the southwestern U.S. And if you live in California, you've experienced desert animals, and really, my father was a huge reptile guy, a serious amateur herpetologist. And so we just traveled. Our family vacations were getting in his old mail Jeep and driving down to Baja, to go look for some snake that he had read about in a journal, or
awesome.
Or going to Borrego Desert down in San Diego and looking for reptiles. So yeah, that's it.
Right. And so did you go to college in California, or did you major in anything special?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I majored in biology to start, and then I kind of started gravitating towards the arts more, and I actually graduated with my degree in two-dimensional design. So at this point, I can draw a snake really well.
That's awesome, though. It's a good skill.
Yeah.
Did you go to graduate school after that, or?
I did not. I actually just kind of dropped out of the biology part of it, and I got a great opportunity as a young man in my early 20s to start working as a keeper at LA Zoo, and I just made working my priority, really.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. This is cool. This is cool. Cause we have a lot of our fans are young. They reach out to us. How do I get involved in conservation? They're always wondering, like, do I have to major in biology? Do I have to go get a master's degree? Do I have to go get a PhD? And so you're kind of saying, I did the arts, but then you did get a job at the LA Zoo. And so you've just kind of worked your way up, right, to curator. I mean, that's a big job.
Yeah, I mean, the business has certainly changed, but it's funny when you meet people in the wildlife business. We come from so many different backgrounds, and I think nowadays you really do need to have an advanced degree, or at least a bachelor's, to get your foot in the door. It's really important. But I always say too, there's certain practical skills that you can't learn in college. There's not a college I know of that teaches you how to put a green mamba in a restraint tube and pull its eye caps off, right? So there's a lot of value in getting that experience through volunteering. Something I think is super important for kids these days, to get out and volunteer and put the work in and see what it's like, and meet people, have people meet you. So that's some of my best advice I give folks these days. But certainly, education is ultra important, of course.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, to start out in the zoo world, that's kind of what we have seen and recommend is, you can either go to Moore Park College or Santa Fe College Teaching Zoo if you want to be a zookeeper, or major in biology or something like that. But, there's a huge interest in a lot of people that want to get involved. So that's awesome.
Yeah, so those colleges are great facilities. I mean, we have a number of keepers here that came through those two facilities.
Yeah, they're really good. They're really good. So you said you started off as a keeper at the LA Zoo. Can you kind of talk about your career there, leading up to now the curator? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I started off, volunteering in the late 80s, and I just was waiting out an opportunity where there was a keeper position. I was hoping for one in the reptile department, and something popped up that was kind of a you worked all over the zoo part-time, got your foot in the door, kind of a position where I was working birds, mammals. I worked rhinos for several years. But of course my love was herpetology. So, the management at the time was like, all right, we got to get this kid in the reptile department full time. And eventually just worked my way up into a full-time position, and then up the ladder from there. But, prior to working the zoo, I was working all kinds of different jobs, which I think is really important because, work ethic is huge, right? So I was working as a plumber's apprentice when I was 18, 19 years old, crawling under houses and busting my butt all day. And then I got a job doing some freelance model making work for the studios. I built some models for Edward Scissorhands back when that was being developed. And that was a really great way to see how to work, 14-hour days. And so it kind of built up that work ethic. So when I did get to the zoo and I was doing something I really loved, man, it wasn't even like work,
No, it never is. When you're following your passion, it's like you don't have enough hours in the day to do what you love. It's just, it's crazy. So now you're curator. Can you kind of tell, just for our listeners that have never worked at a zoo or don't really understand what a curator does?
Yeah, so the curator position, like you would, most people hear about curators of art collections, right? So we're managers of a collection. In my case, I'm managing a collection of live animals, right? So we as curators decide what animals will be prioritized for, say, conservation programs or breeding priorities for the zoo, how to exhibit certain species, how to build their habitats so that they present themselves nicely to the public and also meet all the requirements for whatever animal you're trying to keep alive. It's those kinds of things. It's, at the curator level, quite honestly, you're working with a lot more paper than you are hands-on with animals. Being the animal keeper is really the fun part, and I did that for many years, but curating is fantastic. Getting to manage a collection of species that you're passionate about is just really amazing.
Yeah. And we're going to definitely talk more about, the current status of reptiles and amphibians and some of the critically endangered ones you're working with. But, what's a day in the life at the zoo for you as a curator?
Yeah, it's different every day, quite honestly. You come into work and, I try to get out and see the collection and my people every day. Doesn't always happen, but get out, walk through the exhibits, talk to the folks on the ground that are working hands-on with the animals. That's kind of my priority. Of course, we have a lot of meetings, but correspondence is important. Talking to other zoos and finding out what they're doing. We move a lot of animals in between facilities as breeding recommendations and other things. But it's communication is probably the biggest part of my job. There's a lot of email, a lot of phone calls, a lot of attending conferences and things of that sort.
Right. I mean, and that's perfect. That's like a perfect setup for this next question. And this wasn't planned, but you talk about moving animals between facilities and, in this podcast and others, we really have talked about the mission of zoos today. And this has been a mission, we did actually a really great podcast last year on why zoos matter with Corbin Maxey and Angie and myself. And we kind of gave the history of zoos and zoos. This isn't a new thing being interested in conservation. I mean, if it wasn't for, I think the Bronx Zoo and Smithsonian Institute, bison would be extinct.
That's right.
They came together over 120 years ago.
Right.
So zoos have always been involved in conservation in one way or the other, but today the mission is more critical than ever. So my next question is, being that you are an expert in reptiles and amphibians, how are they doing in the wild today?
Yeah, it's a big question. And there's not an easy answer for it. I mean, there's not, there's certain species of reptiles that are kind of like coyotes, right? So we still see alligator lizards in our backyards all over Southern California. They've adapted well to urban sprawl, but that's not the norm, right? So, and there's over 10,000 species of reptile and thousands of more species of amphibian. There's massive decline in a lot of those groups of reptiles and amphibians. And a lot of these animals, because they're kind of the lesser known animals, they're not the fancy, pandas and giraffes and lions and bears. it's data deficient, we call it. We really don't know what's happening. There's certainly drastic declines in many of the populations, especially in amphibians. Amphibians are kind of the canary in a coal mine, if you will. They're generally considered kind of sensitive animals. So, we've discovered some, or we've described some species of amphibians. I think of the golden toad. It was described, I think, in the 60s, and it was gone by the 80s, right? So there's a lot we don't know. The turtle and tortoise situation right now across Asia is dire. We're seeing animals that are, boatloads and truckloads of endangered species being taken out of the wild. And of course, that's dwindling. But, just recently I think it was the Palawan forest turtle that there was a confiscation that happened in Asia. And there were more of those turtles found in the back of one truck than we thought still existed in the wild. So that's the bad stories, but it's really hard to say exactly how the whole group is doing. But I like to, when you talk about these lesser known creatures like reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, etc., they don't get a lot of attention, but they're kind of like the foundation, right, of biomes. And you don't really see a lot of what's going on with things that are living under the dirt and the cracks and crevices until all of a sudden the house collapses, right? It's the fancy. Somebody kind of used the analogy. It's like, okay, when your fancy kitchen is failing, that's kind of like the panda, right? Because they're out there, they're big, they're flashy, and when there's a problem with those, but you don't hear about the freshwater mussels that are disappearing. Right. They're the filter system for freshwater rivers and things of that nature. So we've got a problem on our hands with reptiles, amphibians, and some of the invertebrates and fish. Yeah.
No, I mean it's so true, and it's easy to talk about the megafauna and people get enamored. You're like the panda or an elephant, and people are like, oh my goodness. And, we're going to sit here and talk about the southern mountain yellow-legged frog here in a second. Who cares, right? Oh, it's just a frog. We have tons of frogs. Well, you alluded to it, and I don't know if we can expand on it or not, but the food web, how critical are reptiles and amphibians? You talked about the base, but, if we start removing... So I guess I could propose a question like this. If we start removing these species from the environment, which we are, how do you foresee from your standpoint that biome surviving?
Well, yeah, like you said, you're taking out the foundation of a particular biome. You even take the insects out of it, and it's just this kind of domino. I'll tell you, we did, and I haven't mentioned this to anybody yet, but I was just thinking about it. When we did our first release in the Jacinto Mountains, the LA bred frogs, and we walked through the canyon, I remember how many the mosquitoes were just out of. It was unbelievable how many mosquitoes and insects were, and that was a canyon where the frog was extinct. And I thought to myself, gosh, I wonder how much of an impact this frog being gone is attributed to the increase in the mosquito population. And we know how many diseases, say, mosquitoes carry. So that was something I thought about. And then in going forward now, I've been in canyons where there are still some frogs existing, and I didn't experience that. So, it's just an example of, and this is all just, my observation. There's no real science behind that. But, from our own self-preservation standpoint, right? Do we need to start thinking about some of these little creatures that we're not thinking about?
And that is the theme I've been really hearing, talking to people like yourself the last few months, and something that we've started to talk about too. It's not just survival of an amphibian or a specific reptile. It's all species, including Homo sapien.
That's right.
Because, something's going to survive. Every mass extinction, except I think the third, where almost everything didn't survive, but we did somehow. Life did somehow find a way. Yeah. And now we're in the sixth. Something's going to survive, but the question is, does Homo sapiens survive? We don't know, because it's becoming a real critical tipping point. So it's interesting you talk about the frogs too. The canyon, because the insects and how nature always finds balance, and when it's out of whack, you're going to see things like more mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a story that needs to be told, and again, that's why we're happy you're here.
And it's tougher too with a frog like the mountain yellowlegged frog because
Mm.
they're not a flashy, sexy creature by any means, right?
Mm-mm.
You know.
No, and I did. I was going to jump into him next because when I did get to go behind the scenes there at the LA Zoo and see your breeding facility, and your keeper Marlo was talking to me about the frogs and what you were
Mm-hmm.
doing and the reintroductions you were about to do. I think this was in the fall, back
Mm-hmm.
September, October. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Like, I didn't know about them, because obviously I've been living away from California for a while, but
Sure.
here's a species in my own backyard that's critically endangered, right?
That's right. I mean, it's one of the most endangered amphibians on the planet. It's right here in Southern California. It's an animal that existed by the thousands throughout our mountain ranges here and on the San Jacinto, San Bernardino, and San Gabriel mountains. And now we're looking at potentially fewer than 500 adult animals existing in all three mountain ranges. That's dire.
Right. And can we just, I guess, kind of just talk about, their history and then the pressures leading up to them being critically endangered or almost extinct?
Yeah. So, I kind of describe their situation as the perfect storm. Mountain yellowlegged frogs, as I mentioned, were ultra common throughout the mountain ranges. They're found. Their particular niche is a little different than what you think of when you think of an amphibian. Most people think of amphibians, they think of kind of warm, hot, humid areas. But these guys are found in the mountains, and they did very well in the mountains. One of the main pressures that's led to their decline has been an introduction of invasive trout species, rainbow trout in particular, and they've done a number on them. And then on top of that, we have major drought issues. We have chemicals that are still in the water systems that have kind of leached into these pristine mountain environments now that are impacting them. And then the chytrid fungus, which, is kind of a cosmopolitan issue for amphibians, but that's also kind of played into the whole, demise of the mountain yellowlegged frog.
Right, because usually when we think of a species, this obviously is human cause, but it's like, urban development or the destruction of an environment. But you're saying this is more introduction of trout. So I guess what's the history of us introducing trout into these streams and rivers?
Yeah. I mean, it's the trout were introduced to create fishing holes for people. And trout did really well in our local mountains. He's introduced trout, and there are native fish that do feed on mountain yellowlegged frogs and their tadpoles. But introducing the voracious rainbow trout was a big problem for them. And it's a challenge too. It's part of this whole restoration of habitat and reintroduction of the frogs that we're working on. We've built trout dams, for instance, so that the frogs, the fishermen can still have their fish downstream and the frogs can exist upstream in their alpine environment. But, then all it takes is one fisherman to catch a rainbow trout and hike it up the canyon and release it in his own personal fishing hole he's created. Right. And all of a sudden you've gone 10 steps backwards. So that's an issue too. But yeah, it's primarily been the rainbow trout. But I mean, when you look at any species now, I mean, regardless of chytrid fungus or what it might be, I mean, habitat destruction is the biggest issue, really.
Right. I mean, across the planet, yeah. I mean, that's where we're seeing a massive decline. But like this specific species, so can you kind of talk about how they survive in this colder environment? Because I think most of our listeners, or what we think of as amphibians living in warm, moist environments, but
Right.
Here they are living in the cold mountains. Where just last week we had snow.
Yeah,
There,
I mean,
so,
that's what makes them really unique in that they can survive under snowpack, right? So all of these frogs right now, as we speak, are hunkered down in a mud bank or at the bottom of a stream bed with snow and ice on top of them, and this is all part of their natural history. And it's different. Like I said, it's not exactly what you think of when you think of amphibians, but they've adapted to it. As part of that, keeping them, this is something we had to think about when we decided we were going to try to breed and release frogs, was that we had to recreate that here at the zoo, right? Which was not easy. And also the water that they live in is this pristine, or it should be pristine, snow melt water. So the water quality was a huge consideration, in developing our husbandry tech and breeding techniques for the frog. But yeah, they've evolved to live up, they live up to 7,500 feet on these mountaintops, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, okay, so jump into your breeding program, because I did get to go to the frog shack, and it was cold in there, and I was like, oh, this is kind of unique. it's so if you can just kind of expand on that, like kind of your breeding program, what you're currently doing with them.
Yeah, so I mean, we jumped into this program about 10 years ago, and the USGS really kind of jump started it and got together with San Diego Zoo's Center for Reproduction of Endangered Species, which it was at that time. And they started working with the population in the San Jacinto Mountains. And at this point, the Rana muscosa, the southern mountain yellowlegged frog, had not been bred in captivity, and they were able to do that. We jumped on a few years after they started. We had actually been, prior to that, involved in some yellowlegged frog conservation by holding animals that were endangered during fires. So we had a little bit of background, at least keeping them alive in a captive situation. But moving forward, we jumped on the breeding program and started breeding San Jacinto animals from that particular mountain range with San Diego. And together we did very well. I mean, both of our facilities produced hundreds of tadpoles for release and frogs as well. And as it's kind of evolved, the Los Angeles Zoo now is kind of transitioned towards working with the San Gabriel population. So from, a geographic standpoint, it made more sense because the San Gabriel Mountains are right outside our back door here. And that particular population is actually the most critically endangered of all the three mountain ranges. So really, and we're learning. We use other amphibians as models when we take on, an animal that has very little, history in keeping them alive, even in captivity. So getting out in the field, taking a look at the animals in the wild, their natural habitat is something that we use to kind of translate to how we've kept them here. And that gets into a whole bunch of specific, interesting, tricky things we've done to make them reproduce here.
Right. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I just found it fascinating. It's just the stuff you had to learn, about their cold environment, the water quality, things like that. So, what have you learned about these frogs going through this? And let me just preface that real quick. That can benefit other species too. That's the thing that's the thing I really want listeners to understand is all of these efforts that you're pouring into this one species will benefit many others, right? So, sorry, it's a long question, but
yeah, I'll try to address all of it. I mean, when you're working with a species that, like I said, there's very little data on how to keep alive or even reproduce. You look at model species, species of similar habitats or of similar taxa, but in this case. We also had a great background at Los Angeles Zoo in keeping montane pit vipers and breeding them. And we used a lot of that husbandry technique, and it translated over to the mountain yellowlegged frog breeding strategies that we implemented. So what we have done is we've tried to recreate that seasonal change in temperature and also the photo period, which is very important. Along with, we know this about amphibians in general, that the water quality is paramount, right? So we know that we had to set up certain type of filtration and UV sterilization and a certain type of water flow for this frog that we saw in the wild, So we have these strong rushing streams, right? So we didn't want to have a stagnant pool of water for them. So we created these kind of stream bed situations for our husbandry. But again, going back to the cooling and the seasonal changes in temperature, we use our vipers kind of as a model. So we have certain vipers, for instance, we work with an Armenian Viper here that encounters similar changes in temperature where they come from at the tops of mountains. And we've been breeding them, and we actually moved them into a refrigerator at one point in their hibernation. So to get them just cold enough, and it's worked really well. Right. So with the frogs, since they're going to be living in water for the whole season, we put some really high-powered chillers. We have air conditioners. I mean, when you walk into this yellowlegged frog room, it's not like you walked into any other reptile house you've ever been, or any other amphibian house you've ever been.
No.
You've been there.
No. Yeah. 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 It's freezing cold. And so I guess, some of the stuff you've learned, have you been able to apply? I know you share this information. I mean, obviously
Right.
at conferences and stuff like that, but has this benefited other species? I mean, you talked about the viper. So the viper experience benefited this frog. So, can we anticipate this frog, what you're learning, benefiting other amphibians?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, the program and the kind of the strategies that we've developed here, I don't know if that they've translated directly to any other species, but we have looked at, switching it around a little bit. On the flip side, look at hellbenders, that zoos are doing great work with in the Southeast. And, some of that technology that they've used has helped us also develop some of our husbandry techniques here. So, but going forward, yeah, I mean, this is all great information. And of course, there's no trade secrets here. We share, that's what it's all about. Everybody's in the same game here.
No, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And I'm just thinking of like, I don't know, those 300 species of poison dart frogs. Right. And, and some of those are in kind of alpine conditions, right? And in South America, or just, frogs around the world.
Sure.
So the information you're learning here, turn around and apply it to another critically endangered species would be phenomenal.
Yeah, and that's and it will help, I'm sure, down the road. These are, they're not completely unique. There's other amphibians that live up in high, alpine situations, but they're very different. They're far from typical of a frog, that's for sure.
So when you decide you're going to reintroduce them, can you kind of talk about that decision process, where they go and how you reintroduce them to the environment?
Right. So, this is where I want to make sure I mention all of our great partners in this, right? So we have the USGS, California Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are all part of this fantastic project. And recently we have Henry Dorley Zoo in Omaha that has jumped on, and we're getting other partners that are jumping on. So to answer your question, we meet and we discuss and make those decisions as a group. Our role here at the Los Angeles Zoo is it's quite simple. We are breeding frogs for release into the wild, and we're really good at breeding and keeping amphibians and reptiles alive here. But those decisions on exactly where to release them are really with the USGS. Again, as a group, we discuss it and look at different. We have to evaluate particular canyons to see with these drought situations we have, for instance, you get water pools that we know are historical sites for yellowlegged frogs, or there might even be one or two frogs still living in these canyons, and these pools through the drought recede to, a puddle. And you're like, wow, do we really want to release frogs or tadpoles here? And then you get these massive rain events like we had last year. And then all of a sudden it's a raging torrent and you have mudslides and slump happening. So that's just one example of the kind of evaluations that we have to do before we make a decision on where to release them. And a lot of that field work is done by the USGS, and those biologists really do great hard work hiking into those canyons, man, I'll tell you.
Right. And I'm sure they're like evaluating the water quality and ensuring there's no rainbow trout, right?
Yeah, and the rainbow trout's a big, the removal of the rainbow trout is also a big part of it. And California Fish and Wildlife has been great in helping, in the removal process. And we send zoo staff out to help with that, help with building fish dams, for instance, that I think I mentioned before, getting the rainbow trout out, and then, doing several checkups on that, because, gosh, the last thing you want to do is take all that work and release 1,000 tadpoles into a canyon and have the trout eat them up, right?
Right. It's like feeding time. So I guess you say you release them as tadpoles and not as adults? So
we've done a little bit of both. The survivability of frogs is obviously going to be much, much higher, but also the resources it takes to grow 10,000 tadpoles, for instance, into 10,000 frogs is just not, just not realistic. So we've done a little bit of both. We do have when San Diego and LA were working on the same mountain range there for a while, the San Jacinto population, we had released a number of tadpoles in a canyon where the yellow-legged frog, the historic canyon that they had lived in and that they were now extinct. And we released a number of tadpoles there. And those tadpoles, from the last I heard, are actually breeding pairs of frogs now. So we know it works.
Oh,
we know tadpole releases work.
Right. And so their current status, you said there's about 500 adults in the wild right now?
Yeah, and that's just a guess. I've heard numbers of fewer than 300. It's hard to say. And I'll tell you, it's funny. Some of my staff went out to release tadpoles. A couple of my senior keeper and one of our other keepers of the frogs went out last year to release tadpoles in the canyon, and they actually saw a live mountain yellow-legged frog in one of the canyons, which was fantastic.
Yeah,
I still have not seen a southern mountain yellow-legged frog in the wild myself.
It's on your bucket list, right? Yeah. I will see one. I will.
Yeah, I've seen thousands of tadpoles and hundreds of adults in our breeding program, but never one in the wild. So, yeah, it's pretty funny.
Now, do you have a count on how many adults you have under human care right now?
We have about 35 here at the zoo that are part of the breeding program. I'm not sure how many San Diego is holding now, and as I mentioned before, Omaha's Henry Dorley Zoo has jumped on the program just recently, and they've got some animals that they're breeding as well. And we've got a number of other zoos that we're prepping to get on this program as well. But out of our 30-ish frogs, we manage them as two separate canyon populations. So we're breeding just those separate canyons, and then we manage their offspring separately. And then those offspring, the tadpoles, are being released in the different tributaries, that match up with those canyons that they came from.
Right. This question just came into my head. So with amphibians, how do you ensure genetic diversity? It's something we can do. In mammals, we go and do some genetic testing, or we have a stud book on them, or whatever. Mm-hmm. In breeding unrelated pairs. How do you do that in frogs?
Well, you can't keep stud books with frogs, and there are ways of identifying individual frogs, and even individual tadpoles. The problem. And you really touched on probably going forward, what is going to be a bigger issue for us to deal with is that these are genetic bottlenecks, right? We only have mm-hmm. a few hundred frogs to work with, and most of those are still in the wild. So when for instance, our group of animals that we're working with at LA Zoo, they were collected in two canyons, as I mentioned, as tadpoles. And when they were collected to bring into this breeding situation, we tried to get a sample as best of a cross-section of genetic diversity as possible by just trying to collect them from different sites up and down the river. But we don't know, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They could literally be all from the same pair of frogs. So it's tough, and that's something that we're going to have to look at. We've seen some issues with certain tadpoles that might indicate that there is, some genetic issues going on. We've had tadpoles with crooked tails, for instance. That could be nutritional. That could be, a million different things. But could that be related to genetics? Maybe. And that's going forward something that we're going to have to look at more closely, including potentially taking frogs from separate canyons and then going ahead and breeding those together. Now they're the same species of frog. It wouldn't be like we were crossbreeding, a different species. They're the same species of frog, but they are isolated from each other. They're disjunct populations. And so that might be just enough genetic diversity to keep us going. But those are some of the big questions, going forward that certainly some of the geneticists who are a lot smarter than I am will have to probably make that call.
Yeah, that's why pay them the big bucks, right? And
that's right.
I mean, it's like we get down to these critically low populations, whether it's an amphibian, a reptile, or a mammal, a bird, and it's when you have uniform genetics, it doesn't bode well for survival. So that's why this is one of those things that we always have to keep in consideration. Is we want a genetically diverse population so they can resist disease and some other things, and so it's like, so when you get down, like right now, the vaquita porpoise, it's in the news. It's getting a lot of attention, and now they're down to a dozen. And
it's dire.
Yeah. It's now we've recovered populations. The good news is, it's always want to tell people the good news. These populations can recover. It's just a challenge we have. in wildlife conservation. So, I think it's fascinating to think about it with amphibians and reptiles, because it's just something that doesn't usually pop on our radar.
Yeah, they're not as complex organisms as vaquita, or some of the megafauna that we've talked about earlier. So in some cases, and I'll give an example, we know that certain groups of reptiles and amphibians, mountain king snakes that we have here in Southern California, you can walk through the forest for miles and you'll come across a large rock pile, the size of your house. And there exists a population of mountain king snakes, and genetically they're all related. And there's just enough genetic flow from a male that happens to cruise from a rock pile that's, a mile away, and mix up that gene pool enough to keep them going. So we have maybe a little more luxury in that regard, being, kind of lower vertebrate type animals. But again, there's still a lot we got to learn.
Yeah, no, yeah, it absolutely. And, like we opened up the podcast talking about how critical these animals are to a biome and the environment. So it's definitely issues that we need to keep investigating and keep our eye to. Now, looking at the mountain yellow-legged frog, what are some of the other projects you're involved with right now? Like specifically any other endangered species?
Our herpetology department is doing a lot of really fantastic work. I mean, everything from just funding and sending staff to different projects abroad. We've been super involved in Komodo dragon species survival program. It's a cooperative breeding program within AZA zoos, and I think Los Angeles has produced more Komodos than just about any zoo in the world. There's certainly some farms in Indonesia that breed Komodos like crazy, but Los Angeles has done a ton with Komodo dragons. We support a wonderful program in Indonesia, the Komodo Survival Program, that has local biologists doing, identifying critical habitat for preservation there and on the islands, and that's something we've been involved with as well. So, Komodos have been really close to my heart. But there's a whole bunch of great species survival plan. Reptiles and amphibians that we've been pretty successful with here. The Armenian Viper is one that we've had a lot of success with. I mentioned it earlier. Some of our cooling techniques, we've been able to breed those multiple years in a row.
Right. So we covered, I don't know, Komodo dragons months and months ago, but is there any change in their status right now? I remember we were saying they were going to possibly shut down, I think, Komodo Island to tourism for a while because people were trying to take them home. Not a good idea, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole lot involved in some of the reasons that was being considered. Komodos, it's not so much that they're being taken and, brought into the pet trade, for instance. And there's some of that happens, of course, but it's more, protecting their prey base, which are some of the large mammals, the Sunda deer there, the poaching of the deer, of course, habitat destruction. There's disjunct populations of Komodos on Flores Island where they can't connect with each other anymore because of, villages and cities being built. So it's habitat destruction and poaching of the prey base is kind of the big deal for Komodos. The population is stable in some areas, from what I understand.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting story about them, and just they're so unique. I mean, just such a unique reptile. So you talk about the Armenian Viper. I guess, why care? It's like, from your standpoint, and this goes into, I guess, the yellow-legged frog too. But again, why care about the Armenian Viper? What does it provide?
Yeah, I know that's a tough one. I mean, it's easier for me to care about it because I love all the all the weird and quote unquote scary creatures. I mean, all these lesser known animals. It's a wonderful animal. It's an important part of the ecosystem. Some of the work, and I'll plug some of my colleagues at other zoos, some of the work that's St. Louis and Sedgwick County Zoo there. Jeff Etling, who's a good friend, director at Sedgwick, did his PhD work on tracking Armenian vipers and, again, assessing critical habitat for them. And the work that he did has led to preserving larger areas of, larger expanding parks in Armenia. And that, the domino effect of that is, okay, so you've preserved the Armenian viper, but also everything else that's in there, including some of that, the megafauna like leopards and mouflon and some of those other wonderful animals that live in those areas. So, so there's one example. Again, it's hard, it's hard with a yellow-legged frog. I mean, like, as I mentioned, they're kind of a gray, nondescript. They're not that flashy poison frog that everybody sees, on Discovery Channel and whatnot. Mm-hmm. They're not the sexiest of creatures, but they are important to the ecosystem. And, they're Southern California's frog. They deserve protection.
Right. And it was interesting you talked about that, because it's like we always talk about umbrella species, save elephants and all these species under them. But if you can preserve or, cordon off habitat for, say, the Armenian viper, that's like an umbrella species, but on the way up, I guess, for the big ones, right? And
that's right. And as I alluded to before, it's like, preserving these animals, we're preserving ourselves. So you've got Armenian vipers and snakes in general control rodent populations, right? And we know what a disease vector, rodents can be. The Black Plague, for instance, I mean, we almost wiped out civilization with the Black Plague, and now, mosquitoes. Mosquitoes transmit some of the most virulent and deadly diseases to human beings that we know about. And the animals that control mosquitoes are the ones that I love, right? Frogs.
Yeah. No, it's so true. It's so true. It's so just
we need to think about it for our own preservation,
Yeah. So it said, preserving these animals, we save ourselves. Angie always brings up this quote. She talked to Dr. Sonardo down in Java doing tigers, and he said, save the tigers, save the world. Mm-hmm. And, you can see that from his perspective, but from your perspective, I get it. Nobody likes mosquitoes or some of these diseases, and nature has a balance, and we've offset that balance. So no, that's great right. stuff. It's really great stuff. So some of the other stuff I want to talk about is kind of promote LA Zoo a little bit, and some of the other stuff they're doing. Can you talk about some of the other programs that LA Zoo's involved with right now?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a number of fantastic conservation programs. Of course, one we're probably most famous for is the California Condor program, which, there's a number of other institutions that have been integral in that whole program. But we've really, we've written some of the protocols on hand rearing condor chicks, for instance, and really we were on the ground floor of that whole conservation program, and we work very closely with the facility in Boise and also San Diego, of course. But had it not been for zoo conservation of condors, those animals would be gone. We would just be reading about them like the dodo in textbooks. So that's one I always like to talk about.
No, that one's a great conservation success story that was huge in the 80s. And is still ongoing, right? I mean, they're still up there breeding, releasing. Yeah.
Yeah. We're still cranking out condor chicks every year.
And they're still in trouble. I mean, it's not like they're safe now. It's like we got to keep on top of it, because there's still environmental pressures. Yeah. Still a lot going on with them. So does LA Zoo do a lot of international programs too with partners overseas?
We do. I mean, we certainly support a number of projects all over the world. We're supporting a wonderful project with Indian gharial that's happening in the Chambal River Valley of India, and also expanding into Nepal now. The peninsular pronghorn is a project that we're very much involved with down in Baja, Mexico, in the Vizcaíno Desert. A number of other SSP programs that kind of, they expand out into other countries. We actually initiated the Catalina Island rattleless rattlesnake SSP, which is the rattlesnake without a rattle that doesn't come from our Catalina Island, but the Catalina off the coast of southern Baja.
Okay.
So that's something that we're kind of in my department we're proud of. But yeah, we support a number of projects abroad. We're supporting a king cobra project in India as well. We've supported giant salamander conservation in China and Japan. So yeah, a whole bunch of great stuff happening.
Yeah, I don't know why. Just the giant salamander. that one's they're critically endangered, right? I mean, they're being poached for food. Isn't that true?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. And there's two species of giant salamander, the Chinese and the Japanese. Both are critically endangered, and both are harvested for food. But they're experiencing some of the similar pressures the yellowlegged frog are too. Invasive species have been an issue, habitat destruction, pollutants in the water. But they are considered a delicacy in many parts of the world.
Right. Okay. So here's the question. How do we fix this, Ian? Like we promote conservation optimism and,
Sure.
activism. And we tell our listeners, everybody can make a difference. It doesn't matter who you are. You don't have to be out in the field working with these animals or like what you're doing, but you can make little changes each day in your own life to make an impact. So from your perspective, you've been doing this for a number of years. How can, I would just say an average listener to this program, what can they do to help amphibians or reptiles?
Gosh, I know I don't have the silver bullet, man, but there's a lot of really easy things people can do. It's like, trying to create peace in the Middle East, right?
Right.
These are very complicated issues. And for the average person, just be conscientious of, being a consumer that we are. I mean, and I don't want to get too out in the weeds here, but the elephant in the room is that the human population is expanding massively. There's a lot of us out there, and we need to be more conscientious about how much we use. I think some of the, something as simple as recycling is huge. Everybody can recycle. Think about what you're, waste. Think about what you're wasting. Think about what you're leaving behind when you're in natural habitats. Just not jumping in rivers with your suntan oil all over the place and polluting my yellowlegged frog habitat. Just be thoughtful about what your impact is on natural places and environments, and then support great conservation programs if you can. Simply coming to the zoo and supporting us is great. So much money that we bring in goes back into the conservation programs that I mentioned, and everybody can help. If everybody does a little bit, it'll certainly help.
No, and I again, the suntan lotion, that is a great one. We mentioned it one time, long time ago, and that's why
right?
I keep harboring on. Yeah, it's so true though, right? Like you don't even think about it, especially in California, or wherever you are, down in Florida, you need suntan lotion, or you don't want to get skin cancer, but there's some environmentally friendly ones that you can use. And we'll definitely be pushing those. Yeah, we'll push those. So you've been working in, for the LA Zoo for quite a while. I guess my question is, from your perspective, how important is the zoo today to animal conservation?
Yeah, I mean, just I've been here for about 26 years, and I was involved with the zoo even before I started as a paid employee. And I've just watched our field change so much for the better. Zoos have always provided some sort of entertainment, right? I mean, that's the reality, and people get an opportunity to see wild animals in front of their face. And I think there's a ton of value to that. There are most people in their lifetime will never get to see a mamba, right? Unless they come to the zoo and they can see a mamba and they can learn about it. And we have millions of kids that come through our gates and can read and learn something and gain an appreciation. And I've seen just a change in how kids react to reptiles and amphibians, especially, working in a reptile house. It's like, and I think a lot of that has to do with some of the shows on reptiles and amphibians that make them interesting, and then there's been kind of a change in how people think about the creepy crawly stuff. But in general, zoos now have really transitioned into being more conservation and education, heavy. And that's important because, I looked at, when I first started working here, we had all these exhibits that were built in the 60s, for instance, and some of them were pretty archaic. They were gunite moats and gunite hills. And now, we've literally torn down the zoo piece by piece and rebuilt it, and we're continuing to do that. And we have these fantastic naturalistic type exhibits now that send a much better message to the general public, but they also provide a lot more to the different species. You know, one of the things I like to do in our facility at the lair at the zoo here, so living amphibian, invertebrate, and reptile facility, is we create these little biomes, right, with multiple species interacting with each other. What a cool message that sends. I've got a simple exhibit with beaded lizards and Mexican West Coast rattlesnakes living together. And all day long, hundreds of people come through and go, I can't believe a snake and a lizard can live together. Right?
Yeah.
They've learned something.
Right. Like that's one of the things, like the first day I went to the LA Zoo earlier this year, and it was packed. It was a Saturday. It was almost elbow to elbow, which made me happy because, I got to watch and listen and just take it in and see children excited about animals and the public excited about animals. And I go back to my own experience as a young kid walking around the zoo, being inspired. And so we always say, you never know who the next Jane Goodall is in that population. Somebody in there is going to make a huge difference for wildlife. And yeah, it's amazing what you do. It's amazing what accredited zoos are doing today.
Yeah. If you're not interested, you're not going to care, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. So I guess that leads to my next question. What if zoos went away? What do you think would happen to these endangered species?
Well, I mean, some of them would go extinct. I mean, quite honestly, I think there would be there would be a 1.5 million people in the Los Angeles area that walk through our gates each year that wouldn't have the kind of appreciation that they did after they visited our facility and saw some of these animals for themselves. I mean, hey, look, I like I said, I've been here for 26 years. Every time I walk by and I see a giraffe up close, it blows my mind. You imagine a little kid that's never seen that before and never will probably in the wild, I mean, it's just a lot of value there. I think zoos just present, a ton of educational and they create interest. Like we were just saying, if you're not interested, you're really not going to care.
Right. And it's, it's not just like you said, the conservation and education. It's, how many of these species would go extinct? Przewalski horse, black-footed ferret, California condor, mountain-legged frog. I mean, all of these animals would be gone forever.
Right.
Extinction's forever, and you can't reverse it. You can't change that. So again, critical stuff that you're doing, and we appreciate it, and I know our listeners do. So with that being said, what is this? What drives you every day? Like, what drives you every day to do what you do for the last 20 plus years?
I mean, I just have this kind of innate love for wildlife and natural things. And of course, like I said, my parents were a big part of that, and exposing my brother and I to wild places and spending time in the desert. And, I just, and my perspectives changed a little bit. When I first started, I just wanted to work with animals and do something positive and care for animals. And then eventually build a collection that was significant and meant something. And then, now we're doing all these great conservation things, but the more and more now I'm going, we're really giving back to the world. Okay. So you have, do we want to live in a world where grandkids go outside and they don't get to see a butterfly? There's already places on the planet where people can't see birds flying around. There's places in some parts of Asia where you can't see a bird flying around anymore. And that's our doing, so the longer I get into this, the more I really become passionate about the conservation aspect of what we do here at the Los Angeles Zoo and other wonderful zoos around the country. So I guess that's what drives me more and more. I'm a few years away from retirement, and it's going to be really hard to walk away from this work completely. I'll tell you.
Don't retire. Just keep doing what you're doing. We need you.
I might stick around forever. Who knows? Yeah.
Wait till they kick you out the door in the wheelchair. Then you go, okay, I'm done.
Maybe. Yeah.
I'll go retire. Yeah. So that kind of leads me to my next question, because, I ask this of all my guests, and anybody that's listening to these interviews knows I always ask this question. As a species, we have morality. So do you think we have a moral obligation to fight and preserve these endangered species?
Yeah, gosh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I don't know if I'd call it a moral obligation. Maybe we should think about at the lowest level, self-preservation, right? I mean, and I said this before, if we continue to destroy nature, we're going to ultimately destroy ourselves, and I think it was George Carlin who once said, Mother Earth has a way of scratching fleas off its back, and we're becoming that flea, and we need to really start thinking about our future and the future of our children and our grandchildren. I mean, so yeah, maybe it is a moral obligation, but how can you not just want to? I mean, why would you want to destroy, right? Why would you want to destroy some of the wonderful stuff that we have on this planet, the great, forests and all the amazing diversity that's taken hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to evolve. It's just hard for me to understand why somebody wouldn't want to keep that stuff preserved.
Yeah, it's interesting to get different perspectives on this and that question, and it's a tough one. Yeah. It's a tough one. That's why I ask it, because it's like, you're right. I can't agree with you more. If we destroy nature, we're going to destroy ourselves, and it's not to be alarmist. It's just the truth. The evidence points that way, and it's hard truth, but it should motivate some certain segments of the population to take action. We hope. So politicians, if you're listening, but
there you go.
No, it's taken together when you look at an environment, a biome. So you're looking at the smaller creatures, and and then we look at the big creatures, and then like the insects you talked about. So you got to look at it all, and we have to preserve each piece, because if one piece falls away, that's it. The whole thing will collapse. Right?
That's right.
I mean, you talk about it. Well, so I guess my final question, Ian, is how can our listeners help you? I guess your efforts with the mountain-legged yellow frog, or the mission of the LA Zoo.
Come out and see the zoo. Okay, come out and visit the zoo. Take a walk around our facility. Most definitely come and see the lair facility, which I mentioned before. That's our reptile, invertebrate, and amphibian house. It's beautiful. It's one of the newer facilities of its kind in the country. It's really kind of cutting edge. We have a lot of wonderful things to see. And if you're afraid of snakes, then you definitely need to come into the lair, because you're going to have a whole different perspective on how really cool some of these animals are. Like I said, it's not, you walk into the quote unquote reptile house, you're going to see turtles and fish and monitor lizards living together. You're going to see all kinds of really interesting biomes. We have some species here that you won't see at any other zoo, in fact. So, that's my plug is come to the Los Angeles Zoo, check us out. Learn something. And if you really want to become interested, there's lots of things around the zoo to help you get pointed in that direction. But again, just be conscientious of what you're doing in the environment and how it impacts the little, lesser known animals that are living in the dirt and the cracks and the rock crevices.
That's so true. It's so true. And we always say, when you come out to California, there's a lot to do, but LA Zoo should be on your list as one of the places you stop by and see. It's a beautiful facility. Tons of animals. It's an incredible zoo. And if you can't get to California or wherever you are in the world, we have a lot of listeners from around the world, go visit your local accredited facilities and support them, because it's one world. Conservation isn't just, here in California. It's there in Europe. It's there in Africa and Australia and everywhere. So yeah, Ian Recchio, thank you so much. He's the curator of reptiles and amphibians at the LA Zoo. We're gonna keep following you and your story.
Thanks so much. This was great, and I really appreciate it. This is the kind of thing. This type of podcast is something that's really so valuable now for us to get the word out, for people to be able to listen what we're doing in zoos and conservation community as a whole. So thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the time.
Oh, it was great. It was great. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk again one day.
All right. Have a good one.